Morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you today. It's a privilege always to be with teachers. There is, other than caring and competent parents, no group of people in the world more important than caring and competent teachers. It's becoming more and more and more important all the time. And so being with people who are on the front lines of educating our children is always a privilege for me. I don't get enough opportunities in my life now to teach. I wanted to be a teacher from the time I was 5 years old. I went to kindergarten and thought, that's me. That's the person I want to be. And when I was in kindergarten, I wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. And when I was in grade 5, I wanted to be a grade 5 teacher. And when I was in grade 13, which wasn't a failure year, we had that in Ontario at the time. It wasn't my second year in grade 12. I wanted to be a high school basketball coach and football coach and phys ed teacher. And then I went to university and I had an opportunity to experience things a little bit different. I thought, this would be good. And so I thought, well, I want to be a university teacher, but then they told me, well, you have to keep going then because you can't just show up and start teaching at a university. So I went through this process of learning how to do research and enjoying how to do research. But my first love has always been teaching. And then for the last 15 years or so, I've been doing this administrative work. I have this really weird job called provost. I mean, nobody grows up wanting to be a provost, and nobody even knows what it is. But it's sort of the vice president academic role in the university. And so as a result of having that job, and I was provost at the University of Winnipeg for a few years before I came to MacEwan, and I was the Dean of Applied Health Sciences at Brock University for about 8 years, and then I was at Windsor. I've been doing this administrative stuff, so I really only teach about once a year, one course a year. It's all I can fit into my schedule, but it's my peak experience of the year, and so I'm really excited because I'm doing this phys ed course in the winter term next year. For MacEwan, and I've spent some time on it this summer, and actually I've been building on this concept of physical literacy, so this is actually good professional development for me. I hope it's even remotely good professional development for you. So just to get us going, I do have to put this slide up. This is my colleague James Mandigo. Dr. Mandigo is at Brock University. Some of you, if you were at the International Conference, know that Jamie and I do a lot of things together. He is probably as much a leader in this area in Canada as we have. There are others for sure, but Jamie's of really big influence on me. I mostly channel Jamie Mandigo, so if you can't afford to fly Jamie in from Ontario, I'm here in town, so you get me today. But we do a lot of work. We've been working together since 2005 on a particular project, but we were colleagues from 2002 at Brock when I came there as dean. This project, you see a couple of pictures here from El Salvador. I might qualify actually this week as an international member of your group because I just came in from Guatemala and El Salvador working with the Olympic committees there on a lot of the things around long-term athlete development. And it's being built on this whole idea of alfabetización física, as they say in Spanish, but physical literacy. And so Jamie is somebody that's influenced me a lot. If you really want to get a sense of the details of the stuff you might not get to in the next couple of days, if you just do a Google search on some of the things that Jamie's written, I think you'll find it really interesting to read. He's worked a lot with PHE Canada. Literacy. Okay, here we go. Literacy, big deal. It's become a big deal over a very long period of time. If you can't read, the world becomes a really demanding, difficult place. It's impossible to navigate it. It's impossible to be successful in it. And so there's been a realization that we don't necessarily have the literacy skills that we need to become a really successful society. And so there's been a lot of push over the last 50 years to the point where the United Nations, UNESCO in this particular case, has made a compelling argument for the idea that this is not just the ability to read that we're talking about when the fundamental idea of literacy is put out there. This is an empowerment exercise. Without this, you simply can't move forward in almost anything. And so when they talk about this as being fully essential to social and human development and its ability to transform lives, this is not just the ability to read the newspaper we're talking about now. That's a fundamental level of understanding, but it's more than that. It is about becoming a fully functional human being. And so there's been a lot of emphasis in the original domain of reading, that being the language arts, about reading, how to make it compelling to kids, how to get them excited about reading, how to get them to develop their skills so that they become literate. You don't see things like that. Not very well. Actually, sometimes you do. That would be a good example of when you don't want to read. But for the most part, you would not see signs all over the place saying no books allowed. I'm going to come back to that because in physical education and sport, we actually sometimes do see signs like that talk about don't do that here. It extends to the point where other areas have understood that maybe a failure to achieve a basic level of competence in what might be the equivalent of reading literacy in our areas could be a very damaging thing to people's ability to move forward, again, as fully functional human beings. And so when you see that kind of thing happening, you realize people don't really understand so much what the mathematicians would say is math literacy. There's no really good word, right? Literacy comes from letter, which means it's really easy in the language arts to say, I know what literacy is. Well, there's no matheracy. You know, people talk about numeracy, which is okay, but it's not really the full scope of what it means to be mathematically literate. But what we're finding, of course, is that the word now has been co-opted. Now everybody wants in on the literacy gig, to the point where we're talking about critical literacy, visual literacy, information literacy, digital literacy. It's all about literacy. And it has now spread into our world, to the point where physical literacy is a topic that you've invited somebody to come and speak to you this morning about. You're going to spend 2 days talking about. We have international conferences about it. We have people publishing papers about it. But frankly, on the front line of going into a gymnasium, going onto a field, going onto a court with a group of 30 kids and saying, okay, everybody, we're going to be physically literate by the time we're done, not necessarily the easiest thing to say, okay, what do I mean by that? It's okay to say what it is, but what it means is something different. And so what we're going to do today in this session is what Albert Einstein used to think about as thought experiments. One of the most famous thought experiments in all of the history of humanity was Albert Einstein imagining himself riding his bicycle at the speed of light and wondering what the universe would look like from his point of view. And from that, of course, came the theory of relativity, that it is relative to where you are and how fast you're going that the universe appears to be a certain thing. If you change where you are, how you're looking at it, and how fast you're going, the universe is a different place. And it not only just looks different, it is different. So the fundamental understanding of physics changed, not because of people with telescopes, and not because of people with experiments being done with them, but essentially because Einstein closed his eyes and said, what would it look like if I was riding my bicycle at the speed of light? And that's where E equals mc squared came from. We're going to do a thought experiment today that essentially goes through the process, not anything quite so dynamic as changing the fundamental understanding of the universe, but what does it mean to be literate? Okay, we've talked about the fact that language, math, some other things, this has been a part of the landscape for educators, but let's suppose that our experiment today is, okay, let's look at a few areas and let's see how this plays out either the same way or not the same way when teachers in different areas have to respond to the challenge of making their students the equivalent of literate in their areas. And so our particular thought experiment begins with a principle. There's no one more dangerous than a principal with an idea. It may not be Mr. Skinner from The Simpsons, but at the same time, suppose, as we begin this, that your principal comes to your school one day, and it can be a K-8 school, a 9-12 school, doesn't matter, and says, I've had an epiphany, I have seen the light, the board has informed me that I need to look at my school world differently. It is now all about literacy in every classroom, every minute of every day. If we are not dedicated to the idea that literacy forms the basis for our educational strategy, we're no longer doing our jobs. Everybody get on board. We're all teaching for literacy now. And I don't care what area you're in. So this is the challenge now that's been thrown out to the school. It's all about literacy. And 4 teachers huddle together and say, okay, what are we going to do? We have the math teacher, the English teacher, the music teacher, and the physical education teacher. Everybody else is probably huddling elsewhere, the science teacher, the social science teacher. Okay, what are we going to do? And they all kind of go off in their own directions and say, okay, I have to think this through. Do I really have the goods here to be able to claim at the end of a school year, my kids are more literate in my area than they were at the start of the year as the result of the curriculum I put together and the pedagogy that I've used to deliver that curriculum? And so we begin with these 4 areas, and we're going to walk through them. By the way, I'm going to talk for a little while, and then I'm going to get you guys talking amongst yourselves a bit. So I find me fascinating, but I also know that not everybody does. After about 30 minutes, I bore myself. We have the English teacher. And the English teacher thinks, well, frankly, this is not that hard. Because literacy comes from my area. The word is based on the idea of letters. I actually have this 26 grouping of things that are the basis for everything that we do. And in fact, even the Phoenicians did this like 2,500 years ago. The Mediterranean is the source of our alphabet. People were trading around the Mediterranean and couldn't talk to each other, so the Phoenicians did this ingenious thing of making little symbols respond to different sounds so that everybody could communicate in the same way by understanding what was being written down. So that's a really easy start. There are these basic building blocks, 26 of them, and nobody argues about whether there should be more or less letters in the alphabet. I'd really like to see a new one. That would be a good idea. And then we can make more words sound different. Actually, we have letters now we don't even need. Right? I mean, when you think about it, a C does either what an S does or what a K does. So why do we have a C at all? There's no need for that letter. I think it should be banned. I think we should have 25, make spelling easier. If you take all of those letters and you arrange them in an almost infinite number of ways, some of them become nonsense, but a lot of them become words. So we have another level of organization. I can take the building blocks and I can turn them into units, which I can then match together with some symbols and some traffic signs and some rules about how all of this fits together. You might not even know some of these. Some things we never use. And then, if I know the rules and how to use the building blocks to put together the words, I can create new things called slightly complicated more word collections called sentences. And I can string these things together. And if I string enough sentences together into coherent thoughts, I can create paragraphs. And I can actually start to string the paragraphs together. Boy, this is becoming really complicated, really much more complex than just the original building blocks. But I'm seeing a pattern here. And if I take enough of those paragraphs together, I can actually create entire collections of them that follow through with stories, with narratives, with thought patterns. And so from some very fundamental 26 individual sounds represented on a page, I have now taken that basic set of building blocks and turned it into the most transcendent, complicated, interesting, creative thought patterns that our brains can create. And I can record them and have them there for future generations. I actually can have fun with this. There are games I can begin to play with language. I can actually create spoken poetry in a competitive sense even, where people step up and say, watch what I can do with this set of building blocks. And then you can actually, I like this one, right? It's a very different kind of experience for grandma, depending on where you put the comma. And so you can start to play with the idea of language. You can actually test how well people perform in their comprehension and their implementation of the building blocks. And so, you can argue with whether or not these tests actually test what they're supposed to test and so on. There are people who don't much think a lot of standardized testing. But at the same time, there are some accepted ways of saying you're literate or you're not. Now, there's an environmental context here because right now, you're all reading this. And you're all pretty comfortable with the idea, yeah, I'm literate. I can pass the test. Well, if I threw this up in Chinese characters, you would become instantly illiterate. You know, I know this because of my Spanish. You know, you work really hard at this over a long period of time, and you get better and better and better at it. And at some point, you'd be able to say, I just crossed a threshold. I'm literate. But to be able to do that, you have to say, well, what actually are the elements that cause you to be able to say, now I'm literate in a language? Is it the ability to write it, the ability to understand it when you hear it, the ability to read it? It's all of those. What level do you have to get to before somebody says, you know, yesterday you were illiterate. Today, you seem to have done that final step and now you're literate. Well, we try to capture that in our testing. And you guys know this better than anybody else because you're responsible for deciding whether somebody is able to progress through a particular educational system. Overall, the English teacher walks away and says, well, I'm just deliriously happy because, you know, the challenge was thrown at me. The principal told me that I had to be able to come to the end of the year and say, can you prove that your kids are more literate than when they started the year? And I know exactly how to make that argument. I've got my building blocks. We create more and more and more complex structures from it. We begin to play with it. We begin to create with it. We come out the other end being able to pass a test that says, yep, you've got it all happening. This, by the way, happens to be the Spanish teacher, because the point is that this is not just about English. This is about language more generally. It is about literacy in its original form. Frankly, this is a job that takes the English teacher about 10 minutes to be able to come up with a good argument. So the math teacher goes down the hall and says, okay, where am I with all of this? Because literacy wasn't really a concept formed in my area. But then goes through the same process, really. Well, I have these fundamental building blocks, these numbers. By the way, one of the greatest inventions in the history of human thought was the zero. Imagine being smart enough to realize that nothing needed its own symbol. Because if all you had were these, you know, one, and you can see it, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 9. But what about that? What if I don't have anything? Somebody invented the zero purposefully, right, to make the whole thing work. And in fact, it's Sanskrit and Arabic numbers. Those of you who are familiar with any other languages, there are ways of writing numbers. So there's some building blocks there. This is looking good. And it turns out that you can string them together in an infinite number of ways. That happens to be a number in the quadrillions. But this can go on forever. You can make the sentences as long as you want to make them, or the actual words as long as you want to make them. And then you put some punctuation in, and you start to think about how to manipulate the different versions of the words, and you can create sentences. These are really simple sentences, but you can create sentences. So this is, you know, see Dick and Jane, you know, Jane and Spot. Jane and Spot walk with Dick. You know, all these, Jane and Spot go up the hill. These are simple sentences, but they can get a lot more complicated. I mean, there are people who can read that. There are people who can watch that happen and say, okay, that's a sentence. And I can read it, and I can tell you what that means. And I can actually close my eyes and I can see it. This happens to be a differential equation, which talks about change, right? Water into a bucket and a hole in the bottom, and water pouring out of the bucket. How much water pours in and how much water pours out, and what rate does the water level in the bucket rise depending on how big the holes are when it's going in and going out. People read that stuff. It's not bad. That's math. This is the creation now of things. You put a computer together with all the bells and whistles that make a computer, and you want to just create something beautiful on the screen, all you really have to do is know how to manipulate those sentences. You just tell it what to do. You give it instructions in a language that it understands. And you create outputs based on the original building blocks, the numbers, into words, into sentences, into books. Now that's just, in that particular case, a particular kind of expression of the totality of the complexity of the language. And that's actually a book too. Because when you're building a robot that is going to do these kinds of, I don't know if you've seen the Iron Man movies. I watch these on airplanes because they amuse me when I'm on a long flight. It's all math. You know, it's a way of playing with numbers. Essentially, you take all those numbers, and if you've got a person who can actually weld all of this together, how do you tell it what to do? You just type in the sentences. You tell it what to do. And it could become a lot of fun, a lot of complexity. We have tests that tell us whether we're numerate. You know, the math teacher's thinking, this is not bad at all. I'm going to be able to meet the challenge here. We can tell when something's wrong, right? There are certain specified rules that say, that's not literate, that's literate, that's not numerate, that's numerate. If you insist on speaking like this, we're going to have to claim you to be innumerate, right? So if I keep saying, I ain't got nothing to do today, well, you know what I meant. But if you're the English teacher, you say, you really can't do that, because that's what illiterate people sound like, right? So if you keep saying 2 and 2 is 5, the math teacher will say, hey, you're just kind of innumerate, you're not talking very well. We'd like you to speak more posh. There are right answers and wrong answers. It's one of my favorite ones. You guys have seen all of this before, right? The answers on the exams or anything. This is like one of the most ingenious wrong answers ever. Like it's the rightest wrong answer or the wrongest right answer in the history of mathematics. It's the right answer. It's not the one you were expecting, but okay, there you go. The math teacher may not be as deliriously happy as the English teacher about this whole thing, but you come out of the whole process thinking, I can make a really good argument here. This is not a real big deal for me to demonstrate that what I do is about literacy. I'm going to call it something else. I'm going to ask the principal to give me a pass on the word. Say, if I can just show numeracy, will you be happy? And the principal is inevitably going to say yes, because you're meeting the task. And that leaves our other two people who are thinking, okay, you guys might be happy, but we're not really all that sure that what we do fits into this ability to say, literacy is what we're about. We don't know where we're going with this, and we're not quite sure this is going to work. Frankly, we're not sure our areas ought to be forced into making claims that these other two areas can make rather easily. We don't see how we fit. Nevertheless, they've been given a task in the thought experiment. So the the music teacher goes off and says, okay, well, I'm at least going to try to play the game. I'm going to try and prove that what I do is some form of literacy. I actually have an alphabet. Like I have my numbers, I have my letters, I have my basic symbols that somehow when put together can create something that might be thought of as a word or a sentence. I'm not sure how to do this yet, but yeah, you know what? String enough of these together, put them in a particular context, put some punctuation in, and start to string them together, and there are people that can read this. One of the most stunning moments I ever had on an airplane was I sat down on a flight, I think I was going from Toronto to Vancouver at one, this is years ago, and I sat down and the movie came on and everybody's doing what they do, and the guy beside me pulled out his book. Opens it up, it's a musical score. He read for like 3.5 hours, just read his book, just going through it. He was a cellist, he was a concert cellist. And so he's sitting there, he's reading this, and you can just see that, he's kind of reading like just we read a book, but he's reading the musical notes. And he's hearing it, and it's feeling something for him. He's turning the pages, and he's smiling. He laughed a couple of times as he was going along. And so I actually got in a conversation with him about it. He says, I do this all the time. This is my form of reading. I love this. I don't read books, so I read music. It's what I do. It's what I live. This can get really complicated. That's what he was reading, right? And so for us, most of us anyway, there may be some very accomplished musicians in the room, that is probably like Chinese. And so from a musical perspective, we are all illiterate. We can't read that. We may be able to, if somebody said, oh, well, you know what that really is, and then they just gave you the musical equivalent, da, 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 that's Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Oh, yeah, I know that. Sorry, you're not really literate just because you can hear it, right? That's the equivalent of saying, well, I can hear and speak English, but I can't read and write it. Okay, so where's the literacy drawing line? I don't know. We have to talk about that. But that's a sentence, a very complicated paragraph, maybe even a book full of them. There are games you can play. You make music fun. There are some of the most beautiful expressions of human creativity ever as the result of that simple set of building blocks. I mean, Mozart starts with the same set of stuff that everybody else starts with, right? The same letters, the same punctuation marks, the basics are the same, and some of us kind of create Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and some of us create the Jupiter Symphony. There's something different about those levels of literacy or musicality or whatever you'd like to call it, but there's no doubt that from those very simple things, unbelievably amazing things can happen. There are actually instruments that we use to produce different versions of what the sentences say. It's like having a sentence and reading it with an Irish accent, reading it with the voice of Christopher Plummer, as opposed to the voice of Mickey Mouse. That's a different thing. fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, if you hear Abraham Lincoln say that at Gettysburg, that's probably different from hearing Donald Duck say it in a Donald Duck cartoon movie. Well, if you take that simple sentence and you play it through an oboe, it's a different kind of expression than if you play it through a trombone or a violin. So there's this different forms of practice come out in how you deliver the basic patterns. There are entire communities of practice that come together to do this jointly in collaboration with each other. Orchestras, whatever they might be. There are tests that decide whether or not you've reached a particular level of literacy in this particular area. We all decide whether or not you've reached the standard that qualifies you to say, I'm a musician. I have musicality in a way that's accepted in a particular way. And so, yeah, the music teacher comes away saying, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure my notes are letters. I'm not sure that my actual scores are really paragraphs or books. I'm not really sure that my community of practice, like an orchestra, really is something that links to something they do in math. I mean, math's one of those solitary things. Reading a book tends to be something you do all by yourself. I don't know, but I think I can make the principal happy. And that leaves us with us. Because everybody else now has gone away and said, literacy, no problem. I think I can handle this as a challenge. But now we have the physical education teacher. And she goes down the hall, sits in her office, closes the door, quietly weeps for a moment or two, and said pretty much what the music teacher started with, which is, yeah, this is not for me. I just don't feel very comfortable having to play this game. Because literacy was conceived for a particular purpose, but I'm not sure it fits into the physical world of physical expression that I deal with. But there is this physical literacy thing that seems to have risen up out of PHE Canada, out of a paper that Margaret Whitehead wrote. I mean, there's a lot of ways that these things come into play. Frankly, often what happens is that these big ideas wind up getting far out ahead of frontline practitioners. People like me in a university, and Jamie and others, we have this great idea. And suddenly, everybody's talking about physical literacy, and there's theory, and there are ways of conceptualizing, and there are big ideas, and they're terrific ideas. But at some point, somebody in the board or somebody in the ministry says, okay, we're all about physical literacy now. What are you going to do about it? In Chile, they used to have a physical education curriculum that was essentially built on soccer. You rolled out the soccer ball in the morning, and that was the day for the physical education teacher. And the assumption was, everybody knows how to do this anyway, because it's in the genes of Latin Americans, right? So we don't really have to do very much. Then the Ministry of Education in Chile, almost overnight, decided that this was no longer good enough. And so they shifted gears and said, you know what? We have to have physical education reflecting our cultural reality in Chile. What are we as a nation? Well, we are a nation of the ocean, of the mountains, of the outdoors. Physical education is now going to be about camping. And of course, every physical education teacher in the country overnight became illiterate because none of them had ever been camping. They had not taken kids up a mountain. They had not taken kids canoeing or kayaking on the ocean. They did not know how to teach swimming. They did not know how to teach anything related to what the new ministry guidelines were. But that didn't matter because somebody had a great idea. And in fact, it was a good idea. Chilean kids ought to know that their physical embodiment is related to an environment in which they live. And it's not just about a soccer ball. Unfortunately, nobody provided the teachers with any sense of how they were going to now deliver this as a national goal, with national important outcomes. So sometimes you guys wind up carrying the can for a lot of really good ideas that started here but never backfilled very well, which is why a workshop like this is such a great idea, because you at least get a chance to talk amongst yourselves over a couple of days to say, okay, if this is where we're going, I get it, but somebody has to decide how we're actually going to implement this. What does it really mean? We know what it is. I can close my eyes and sort of see physical literacy, maybe. But does it really compare with what these other teachers are able to do? Do we really have all of those elements? Like, how are we going to do this? Feeling a little confused, a little bewildered, a little disoriented. This sign makes sense. Everybody, for the most part, loves literacy. Maybe you shouldn't read a book when you're riding a bicycle. That's dangerous. On the other hand, people walk around texting all the time. You've all seen the YouTube things of people falling into fountains in Rome and things like that, walking along, down where they go. But we are different. Because we actually don't have that universal acceptance that at any moment, what we do should break out, right? If somebody hauls a book out on the subway in Toronto, nobody thinks twice. Well, they're reading. Somebody puts on their earbuds, listens to the music. Oh, that's okay. We accept that. You could even sort of take out your Sudoku puzzle or your notebook and start doing equations, and people would think, a little geeky on the subway, but I mean, not so bad. We can tolerate that. Try running up and down the aisles or breaking out into a dance on the subway, and people think that. No. There's a constraint here. There's a place for what you do, and this is not it, right? So if you're at the dinner table at home, just standing up, just sort of doing a few calisthenics between courses, do that in a restaurant, you'll probably be on the street. This happens all the time. Now, this gets even weirder. I collect these things. I have no idea what that is. And I love this one. Soccer may only be played in archery range. Presumably not at the same time. But we got a lot of stuff in our profession where people say, there's a place for this. Reading's anywhere, but there's a place for this. Stop reading. No, parents don't usually say that, right? I don't know if I'm sure you have all watched Ken Robinson's TED Talk on innovation and creativity. If you haven't, look it up. He's got a wonderful line in there. He talks about, can you imagine being William Shakespeare's grade 7 English teacher? Stop talking like that. Nobody knows what you're saying. Here's our phys ed teacher then, puzzled. Understandably so. And there's the fundamental problem, right? These other folks have been able to navigate through this thought experiment. What are the letters, the numbers, the punctuation marks, symbols, the rules, mechanisms for building complex and sophisticated ideas that serve as the basis? What's my alphabet? What are my numbers? What are my punctuation signs? What's a word? What's a sentence? What's a paragraph? Does any of this make any sense whatsoever in my world? Because if I can't figure this out some way, then I've got this idea, but it's an empty idea. It doesn't translate into curriculum. It doesn't translate into pedagogy. It doesn't translate into standards. And it doesn't translate into expectations for abilities to be developed through the educational experience by virtue of what I do as a teacher with my children. So what we're going to do is answer those questions. About 10 minutes. I've talked long enough. What I want you to do is see if you can come up with the alphabet. Some of you may already have pretty good ideas about all of this, but what are those basic building blocks of physical literacy that might correspond to the 26 letters of the alphabet, the notes on a scale and all the punctuation marks that go with music, the numbers, whatever it might be, the multiplication signs? Just work in your groups, take about 10 minutes, and see what you can come up with as the basic stuff for a concept of physical literacy that you can use to build curriculum and pedagogy. So we'll go till about 20 after. Go. And we're back. I really hate to break up the conversations because they're pretty lively. You might want to get back to this if you get a chance, maybe over the lunch hour or something like that. I just want to take you through a bit of the discussion that frankly has been happening at the national and international level for quite some time. That's an impossible conversation to have in 10 minutes because there are a lot of people who have been spending a lot of time trying to decide what this is really all about. So what I'm going to do is just reframe here a little bit. So what are the basic elements of a physical literacy alphabet that would correspond to the fundamental building blocks that the other teachers are able to identify? Essentially, in a simplistic way, you know, there's the 1, 2, 3s, the ABCs, the do, re, mi's. What do we got? It probably doesn't rhyme quite so nicely. And there's probably not just 3 of them that you use to define it. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around table by table. We're just going to throw out a word, like one word. I don't care what it is. It'll give us an idea of the different levels of thinking, so you guys can kind of get prepared for who's going to give the first word. We're just going to go around till we run out of new stuff. This will take, 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm just going to start with this table over here. Just give me one fundamental building block. This is non-judgmental. This is not right or wrong. This is not what were they thinking. This is just a matter of getting a sense of what everybody was talking about by just using the building block words that you thought you were coming up with. So I'm just going to go really quickly, one table around and back to here, and then we'll run out of stuff. Okay, so up first, a word.
Skills.
Skills.
Running.
Running.
Balancing.
Balancing.
Kicking.
Kicking.
Skipping.
Skipping.
Throwing.
Throwing.
We're going to make the rhyme. Walk, run, fun.
Okay. That was 3. That's a combined letter. That's like double U as a letter, right? That's 2 U's. Okay. Pattern yet? Okay, let's come back here. Another one. Something that hasn't been done yet. You got to pay attention.
Hopping.
Hopping.
Jumping.
Jumping.
Non-locomotor and locomotor.
It's interesting. Okay, got it. Yeah.
Dodging.
Dodging.
Cognitive.
Cognitive. Okay, that's interesting.
Manipulative.
Oh, no, go ahead as long as we're
I
here.
was going to say receiving.
Receiving.
Striking.
Striking.
Strategies.
Strategies.
Swimming.
Swimming. One more. We'll finish up with this round. Anything new? Nope.
Abilities.
Huh?
Abilities.
Abilities.
Rolling.
Rolling. Fitness.
Balance.
Balance.
You said levels.
Level. Okay. Well, you can see what happens when you have this kind of discussion, right? People go in a particular direction. And if we were to try and take all of that and summarize it into the new national strategy for physical literacy, it'd probably take more than 10 minutes. But it gives you an idea of where the discussion tends to go. This is the PHE Canada version of the alphabet. If you can't see it from the back, dodge, hop, skip, log roll. I've always wondered what it is in my life that I needed to be able to log roll in order to do. But stork stand, balance, right? Jump, kick, dribble, overarm throw, catch, run, sidearm strike. Now that's one version of the alphabet, but just like, English has a version of its alphabet, and Japanese has a version of its alphabet, and Chinese has a version of its alphabet, and Russian has a version of its alphabet, you can create language from different building blocks. You can conceive of language differently. In English, we use letters to represent sounds because that's where language came from. In Chinese, they use characters to represent ideas, and the sentences are not the same at all. But it all works as language if you're clued in to the code. So different physical educators will conceive of the building blocks differently. And that's really important because that then means that your understanding of what curriculum should be and what pedagogy should be will flow differently from your understanding of what the basics are. So if you start with this, you will build a curriculum and a pedagogy that assumes that you're starting by teaching kids the letters. That's how we all started to learn English, right? How to read, right? A, B, C, D, E, F, and if you remember, it was hard. There were 26 of them, and you couldn't do them out of order, right? You had to get them right. There was a right way to think of the alphabet, which when you think about it, makes no sense whatsoever. The alphabet's the alphabet no matter what order it is. They didn't put all the vowels at the front and then all the consonants, right? They just, I don't know why it came out that way, but if you didn't remember the alphabet in order, you were wrong. But in fact, the alphabet's the alphabet. It doesn't matter what order you say it. It works the same way. Well, different tables took a different approach to what these letters were. And so if you followed along on that line, your curriculum would look a lot different. What are the words? Well, not sure. We're still not sure how you divide this all up, whether it actually works. You know, but if you can't run, I think the basis, I heard the conversation. It was exactly a great conversation because people were saying, well, if you can't do this, then you can't do that. And if you can't combine those, you can't become able to do this. So yeah, if you can't run as a basic building block, you can't go out with a dog. You know, there's a lot of things that flow out of that. There are a lot of other things that you can't do. You can't play soccer. You can't play this particular complex activity unless you've got one of the basic elements of it, which is to run. Right? If you can't throw, there's a lot of things you can't do. If you can't throw, you know, how many times in a week do you just sort of chuck something into the wastebasket? Right? For me, this is a game. I love that part of the day, right? I crumble up a piece of paper. It's a challenge, right? There's a lot of things that come out of throwing. You can't swim, can't save a life. You know, that's one of the things that comes out of that. But there's other things, that's one way of conceiving of what a word might be. I'm not sure whether that's the right way to think about it. That's a sentence. Maybe that's a way to think about it, right? Think about what goes into this. Well, this is actually kind of a stork stand, right? It's a balancing act for a long time. And then it becomes a jumping task. And then it becomes a different kind of task with body manipulation using gravity in a different way. And then it becomes a landing task. And maybe there is a log roll thrown in there somewhere, which actually makes it useful to have learned that as one of the letters of the alphabet. But that may represent, you know, a sentence, maybe even a paragraph. I don't know where to draw the line. And then there's these entire artistic works. This happens to be a 7-day across the Sahara Desert run where people actually carry all of their own stuff. They sleep, they camp, they have to carry their own food. It's grueling. It's unbelievably grueling. People shouldn't do this in their lives. But it's kind of a work of art. It relies on balance. They run up and down. They fall on the sand. They have to do all kinds of physical things to be able to create an environment which actually protects them at night from what are actually very cold temperatures, protect them during the day from very hot temperatures. And as I say, they take everything they need for 7 or 8 days. They have to take it all out with them. I don't know what that is relative to, you know, Pilgrim's Progress or Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but there's something in there. It's another version of it, all that jazz, right? You want to go see a choreographed play? Well, there's everything that comes out of this. A lifting skill, a strength skill, is strength. Nobody really mentioned strength, but I don't know whether that's a component of the alphabet or not. You can see the complexity that you get into when you get into an area like physical education, and you have to try to figure out whether you can conform or not. There are entire communities of practice that get together from time to time, whether they be in flash mobs or whether they be in slightly more organized, regular, formal things that engage in these kinds of activities. And there are actually ways of assessing, maybe we don't all agree, but there are ways of assessing whether or not embodied life is forming in a particular way to be able to say, not that you're literate, numerate, musical, whatever our version is, physically fit used to be a standard way of thinking about it. But the new way we're thinking about it is to say, okay, Is that a necessary condition to be deemed physically literate by standard testing mechanisms? How many push-ups do you have to be able to do? I am old enough to remember being in high school when the Canadian Centennial Physical Fitness tests came out, and everybody had to be able to do this and that, and push-ups and pull-ups. And of course, like, you could be the best volleyball player in your school, but if you couldn't do a chin-up, you were doomed in those tests, man. You were not going to get your silver or bronze or gold medal. You know, what do kids have to be able to do to be able to demonstrate in grade 1, in grade 2, in grade 3? Maybe that's not the right way to do it. At age 5, age 6, maybe that's not the right way to do it. Physiological age as opposed to chronological age. Where do you say in the end, okay, at this particular stage of your development, we would expect that you should be able to do this? Well, that would depend. That would define how you do pedagogy and curriculum. You know, all these things that you do, you know, push-ups, sit-ups, and these kinds of things. And then sometimes you just know it when you see it. Right? Sometimes you just know that somebody's failing. And you have to figure out how you respond to that. Overall, you know, I don't know how happy the phys ed teacher is right now. Because it's not easy to define our alphabet. And if you can't define our alphabet, we can't really decide what the words are. And can we really talk about what our sentences and paragraphs are? And what are our stories? And what are our works of art? And do we have communities of practice? Actually, that's the easy one because we have teams. We've actually created various opportunities for people to come together in aggregates to perform physical activity in certain ways. And that can be an aerobics class with everybody in unison. It could be a competitive sport with two groups coming together to try to prove some kind of dominance or superiority in the ability to perform physical work of a particular skilled and creative and innovative kind. Let's assume, though, that there's something in there. And I think the next 2 days are largely about what's in there. Like, where are we with this as frontline practitioners who have the obligation to take this idea, this concept, and deliver it as curriculum and pedagogy? Let's suppose you've made your principal happy, but you're professionals. And just passing the test is not enough, right? You're serious about what you do. And you try to come to the stage of thinking where you develop your own ideas about how you're going to express your professional obligations in a particular context. So there's some challenges still left. Whether or not you can keep the principal off your back is not really the story here. How can we describe the desired endpoint of education for physical literacy? Because that's really what you're coming together to do. Like, what are we trying to accomplish? Like, where are we taking this? And how will we know if we're successful? If you've ever taught, like, primary school band, it's hopeless, right? It's the one part of teaching that's exactly the same in June as it was in September, right? But they had fun, and they're learning something. It's just not coming out the other end of the rhythm band instruments yet. But what are our desired endpoints? Is it to create a love of movement and physical activity? Is it to create competence of a particular kind? Is it to become part of the long-term athlete development strategy of Canada for our Olympic Own the Podium strategy? There's a lot of different ways of looking at why. And what is the meaning? If we know what it is, that's one thing. But what does it mean? What is it for? And that's where we all tend to be at our best professionally. What's the point? What's this for in terms of our kids' development? So, reading the literature, I'm going to rocket through this. By the way, I've got about 14 minutes left. I'm going to stick strictly to it. You've got a big day. You're going to feel a little bit behind the 8 ball here with this. Because if you read the literature that's out there by guys like Mandigo and me and Whitehead and all these folks, I don't put myself in their league, but I hang out with them sometimes. What's expected of you as a professional physical educator? Because you've just walked through your alphabet and your words and things, but what's it for? Well, by the time kids have been through the English curriculum, you hope that they can write, maybe they can create a poem of their own, write a story of their own, think in language, use language, manipulate language, have fun with it. Music, maybe they can play music, maybe they at least understand it when they hear it. Numeracy, they can balance their checkbook. do their accounts, do all these things they're supposed to do, know that 9 times 7 is not somewhere between 25 and 4,208. You know, there's things they can do. Well, here's what the literature says you should be doing by the time your students are finished with you and your curriculum and your pedagogy. Creative, imaginative, clear in expression, competent and efficient, inventive, versatile, and skillful. I wonder how many people graduate from grade 12 English with all of that. At a level where we would say, yep, you've made it. But wait, there's more. You're not even close yet. This is all part of what you will read out there. They have the skills, knowledge, and attitudes across a wide variety of activities. It's not just good enough to be able to do a throw of a particular kind or catch. You should do it with poise and confidence. So just, you know, every once in a while I see a Major League ball player really have an adventure on a fly ball. Right? They go up, they turn around 3 times, they lose it in the lights, they get this, and they finally make the catch, and their teammates are laughing at them, thinking, you're a pro. I mean, how can you make that so hard? Well, in this world, of course, that wouldn't count as having been an example of physical literacy because it was not done with poise and confidence. It was done like a complete idiot would catch a fly ball. Confidently with control in a wide range of situations, able to read what's going on around them in a movement setting and react appropriately. So don't just do what you're told, respond appropriately. Be able to gear yourself to what's going on. If somebody perturbs your balance, get it back. Right? Perform with competence in a wide variety of activities that benefit the development of the whole person. Okay? I'm not sure that we really require the math teacher to demonstrate at the end of it all that as the result of algebra, we've created a better natured person who's, you know, as Lincoln said, right, the better angels of his nature came through. But you, as a physical educator, you're now responsible for the development of the whole person because without it, something, you know, look at the shirt, right? You're not physically literate. There you go. And it gets worse. The motivation and ability to understand, communicate, apply, and analyze different forms of performance. I don't think that really in English the other students are required to evaluate their classmates and what they did and be able to analyze what's going on. That's a good poem, that's a bad poem. But physical literacy literature is out there with this. And make good choices throughout their lifespan that are both beneficial to and respectful of themselves. And now we're going to save the whales. Right? That's now your job. So, just a few test questions. You start to think, okay, physical literacy, like how far do I have to be able to move my students before I can claim that I've done my job? Because apparently it's not enough to be able to do a stork stand. You know, for how long? You know, how long do I have to hold this posture? Oh my goodness, no, I'm doing okay. I can do this for a while. I couldn't do that when I was in grade 1. But at the same time, so far so good as a phys ed teacher, and I looked poised and confident as I did it. And I was thinking about how to conserve water. So that works. But do I have to play fairly? You know, was Ben Jonson physically illiterate?
They're all cheap.
So if they're all cheat, is that okay? And that's a really good point. It's like the Tour de France, right? The Tour de steroids. Knowing the rules of the game I'm playing in detail. I mean, if you've got kids in grade 1, I mean, if you ever coached, 6-year-old soccer. Yeah. Okay, huddle up, we're going to talk about the offside rule. When 6 years, there's no way at 6 years old they're ever going to understand that. There are people in their 50s who don't understand the offside rule in soccer. Do they have to be able to judge good performance from bad? Now, how high is this bar? Do they have to look good while being effective? You've all been through this, right? You're teaching a basketball module, right? And somebody takes a basketball and kind of steps up to the foul. We're going to practice our foul shooting today. So they give it a couple of bounces. Swish. 1 for 1. You're the teacher going, no. That's bad technique. That's not the way you're supposed to do it. Let's try it again. Swish. After 17 in a row, you're thinking, I'm just going to leave this guy alone because he clearly knows how to shoot a free throw. This is not Shaquille O'Neal at his worst, right? So it's going to look horrible. Well, I got to tell you, he's found a strategy to put the ball in the hoop. So I'm going to go for physically literate on this one. Even though by any measure of what that should look like, that's just not a free throw. These are really difficult questions. There are a lot of challenges in this. I'm just going to try and get through a couple, and then I'm just going to bail out of this and let you guys get back to your day. But we all face a lot of challenges in trying to decide how we're going to play this out, because frankly, a physical literacy philosophy that underpins physical education and long-term athlete development, long-term physical fitness development over the lifespan, well, the key element in all of this is that there's an early variety of experience required. And yet this competes in our culture with a preference for early specialization, sometimes by children, sometimes more often by their parents, where you get into this situation of thinking, okay, what the heck do I do when I've got Tiger Woods at the age of 4 and I can see something? What do you do with a prodigy? Mozart was composing when he was 4. So if you're the parent of a prodigy, you think, I guess it's all about golf. I'm like, yeah.
That just reminds me of, there was a recent Time magazine article on 7-year-old basketball leagues and championships in the States. And they have like state championships now for 7-year-old basketball. It was just, and they were debating on the article, the competition, the elitism versus what is it doing to kids, right?
Hey, listen, we live in a world where 1.5-year-olds are in beauty pageants. I mean, nothing surprises me anymore. I mean, we've kind of passed the point where these things surprise me. But it's a good point, because I'm going to get through a couple of things that come back to that kind of thing. Long-term strategies for broad social inclusion require heavy investments in attractive forms of mass participation, keeping everybody engaged. But mass participation competes with elite participation for scarce resources. I can't remember when I was a kid. I mean, the idea of a travel hockey team just didn't exist. I mean, everything was just your local league, and you went home, and then you played, and then the season changed. Then it was baseball season. Now we got goalie camps in July. Right? I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that there is a way in which we structure our embodiment culture that tends to be a little hard on physical educators who are trying to promote the idea of broad-based physical literacy development as a joy, as a necessity, as something you will really be grateful for later, when the real push is to specialize early so you get really good really fast. And so you pick the elite kids out as early as you can, probably relegate a lot of the rest of the kids to something that is not of the same quality with respect to instruction, with respect to facilities, and so on. Physical literacy concepts assume that developmental status is more important than chronological age, but frankly, we tend to put kids into situations where we don't pay a lot of attention to their chronological age, and so you get, these kids are the same age. So if you're, 13-year-old hockey player, well, this kid's probably had an advantage from the word go. But at the age of 16, when this kid grows and he's been skill developed over the years because he's had to be, this guy loses, this guy starts to win a little bit more, and they're probably both going to wish they'd had a different trajectory of physical education experience. Same with the girls in sports in high school. Physical literacy presupposes an integrated nature of physical development, but diverse movement skills are often learned in isolation. We don't always have the opportunity to integrate and to show how all of these things play out. I think it's one of the beauties of the idea of physical literacy is literacy as a concept requires that you learn all the letters. Jamie talks a lot about how you would read if you only learned from A to M. Right? What kind of reading experience would that be if you knew half the alphabet? Or if you knew only the vowels and not the consonants? There are languages, like in Hebrew, you really don't have vowels. You have to interpolate the vowels, and so the consonants can mean different things. They can sound out differently. So bar-or and brower come out kind of the same in Hebrew as a name. But at the same time, we often let kids connect the dots. They're not very good at it. Most of us are not very good at connecting the dots all on our own. Which we get this kind of, I just put this up here because this is the idea of if we really were doing our job, we would have all of this in place. And this would be the experience upon which we would build. You know, I'm not even going to leave that up there. It's just not worth it. So back to this whole idea of literacy, particularly physical literacy, probably the best thing to do as you go through the next couple of days is think of it as a lens through which to see the world of physically embodied life. See whether or not there's something in this that you really think advances the profession of physical education. And this is my big concern with all of this. I actually am really enamored of physical literacy as a concept right now, but it's not because we can prove we're just like the English teacher. That's a mug's game. We don't want to go down that road. We're different, and we should be proud to be different of what we're trying to accomplish as educators. But I think as a concept, it does allow you to think differently about curriculum development and pedagogy development in the same way that other teachers do. And so it's a lens to see the world of physical education differently. It's a way to open some different doors in terms of opportunity for re-envisioning how the experience of children in physical education actually operates in the school. And so is it a way to bring more kids on board who might previously have felt excluded because a particular way of thinking about their experience was not really being valued? Yes, the Chilean roll out the soccer ball thing. Well, that automatically just leaves the big kids dominating the little kids, the boys typically dominating the girls, mostly on size. All these things become doors closed. So does it open doors in particular ways? And you know what, I'm just going to stop right there. I could go on for hours on this stuff, but the main thing is here that there is this framework that comes out of PHE Canada, and that's your organization. That's where you guys are. They are you. And that's kind of the basic statement that they have come up with, and Jamie and a few others at Brock helped write that with the folks in Ottawa. So individuals who are physically literate move with competence and confidence in a wide variety of physical activities in multiple environments that benefit the healthy development of the whole person. That's a big job. And we all know this. There is no teacher in any school who is more attuned to what kids are doing, how they're feeling, where their lives are than the physical education teacher. You know, you're all the ones that kids go to. You're all the ones that see kids at their best, at their worst, and understand that their lives as academic, intellectually developing kids in a school where reading, writing, arithmetic, you know, I think, therefore I am, has been the dominant thing since Plato and Descartes. You know, we've been really disadvantaged in this. Yet despite it all, you're the ones who see child development in a unique and really important way, because all the things that are happening in a kid's life come right out through the body. I did this sports psych thing with figure skaters for the longest time. There's a world, right? But everything you are, everything you're thinking, everything you're feeling, this was my standard mantra. It's going right through your skate blades. Your skate blades cannot be separated from everything that's going on in your life. You guys see that all the time. I think the question for you over the next day or so is just whether or not physical literacy as a concept helps you organize your thinking about being that professional educator of a particular and unique kind in a way that helps you move your kids forward and your own way of understanding curriculum and pedagogy forward. So, sorry, I'm 3 minutes over, but there's only 47 more slides. But I knew I wouldn't get through everything. So there you go. I'm just going to stop there, and I really do thank you for your time and patience.